And today we are going to learn about one of the most important American writers of all time, Walt Whitman, American bard and father of free verse. So make sure that you have a paper and pencil ready so that you can take notes as we go. And as always, be sure to pause the video if you need to write something down or read the slides. So in this lecture, we're going to cover Walt Whitman's life and the world he lived in, especially his relationship to the Transcendentalists. We'll talk broadly about Leaves of Grass and its importance, and then we'll take a really close look at Song of Myself and some of the important themes, motifs, and formal elements you should look for as you read. So by the time Walt Whitman died in 1892, he was probably the most photographed person in America, especially during the 19th century. The image in the upper left corner of the screen here was taken in 1891, a year before his death, when he was 71 years old. By the time of his death, he was a verified celebrity. His funeral was a public event. At least 1,000 came to pay their respects at the viewing. And when his casket was carried to the cemetery by a horse-drawn hearse, thousands and thousands lined the streets to see it. But Whitman's life didn't begin quite so auspiciously as it ended. He was born in 1819 on Long Island, the second of 9 children born to Quakers who were neither wealthy nor able to provide their son the type of formal schooling Emerson received. Whitman didn't attend Harvard or any other school past the age of 11. Instead, he went to work for newspapers and print shops in and around Manhattan and Brooklyn. Whitman's apprentice as a printer and journalist working for newspapers in New York City informed his sensibility as a writer in a number of ways. Not only was Whitman's early consciousness infused with the active urban life of a growing city, but his intimate understanding of the working of antebellum print culture informed both the typography he used for his poetry and the episodic journalistic style of the poems themselves. Scholars of American literature are virtually unanimous in agreeing that no single book did more to transform America and ultimately world poetry than the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass. With its bold rejection of poetic norms, its self-consciously American diction, and the unique poetic persona of a man who was at once a representative of his nation and a distinct, idiosyncratic individual, Leaves of Grass influenced and continues to influence generations of poets. Despite the impact that the book would eventually have, however, it had a rather inauspicious beginning. If you remember about about Emerson having to publish his own book, Whitman did the same. He paid to have this book published himself. It came out to mixed reviews. The reception was so mixed, in fact, that he started writing and submitting anonymous reviews of his book, praising its greatness, and there's even evidence to suggest that Whitman came nowhere close to selling all 800 of those copies. At one point, Emerson famously sent Whitman a letter of praise, which Whitman capitalized on by reprinting without Emerson's permission in a New York City newspaper, again, just trying to get interest of the work. And again, he would put that letter in the appendix of the 1856, the second edition of Leaves of Grass. So Leaves of Grass goes through 6 major revisions over the course of Whitman's life: 1856, 1860, 1867, 1871, 1881, and before his death in 1891. In each edition, Whitman would add, subtract, and rearrange the poems. The ones that you have in your textbook come from the 1891 edition. He would change individual words and lines, as well as the cover of the book and the typeface of the poems. Take a look at the image that you see on the screen. This is the title page for the very first edition, 1855, of Leaves of Grass. Notice that this title page mentions a place of publication, Brooklyn, New York, but not a publisher. So we've talked about the difficulty American writers had in publishing book-length manuscripts before international copyright law. It simply wasn't a good investment for most printers and publishers. So it's not surprising that Whitman was unable to find a publisher for his book. Like Emerson with Nature, he paid out of his own pocket to have those 800 copies of it print and bound. Whitman hired Andrew Rome's small family print shop to produce his book of poems, even though the majority of the print shop's business came from printing legal forms. Now, his budget was tight, so he saved money by printing on the same paper used for those legal forms because it was already on hand. This means that the 1855 version of Leaves of Grass has a really distinctive quarto size. It's not a typical book size collection. Whitman claimed to have handset some of the type himself, and it appears that when he caught a typographical error on a page coming hot off the press, He kept and later bound the page with the error on them rather than pay to reprint the correct pages. Now, at this time, antebellum publishing was on its way to becoming the compartmentalized industry that we have today, with different groups of professionals devoted to writing, editing, proofreading, printing, binding, distributing, promoting, and selling books. Whitman, in contrast, took all of these roles on by himself. The first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855 also did not include an author's byline. The copyright is attributed to Walter Whitman, but at no point does it say on this page or anywhere else in that first edition that the book is by Walt Whitman. Instead, Whitman included this portrait to identify himself as the author of the book. Since you're probably not familiar with the particulars of 19th century fashion, you might not see anything really startling or interesting about the way that Whitman is dressed in this picture. But at the time, his appearance in the clothes of a common worker would have made a statement. It's just not how poets and writers presented themselves usually. In short, Whitman was trying to send a message by dressing and posing this way, with his hat cocked to one side, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his collar unbuttoned, without jacket, without tie. He is aligning himself with the everyman and portraying himself as the working class laborer that he actually was. Antebellum reviewers were quick to note that Whitman had the demeanor and appearance of a working class outlaw, with one reviewer in particular saying that he bears, quote, the true likeness of half a dozen celebrated criminals. That reviewer might not have been too far off the mark. Whitman refers to himself in Song of Myself as, quote, one of the roughs. In the vernacular of the 19th century New York, the roughs were the working class urbanites, many of whom were immigrants who were feared and distrusted by the city's middle class population. One New York City guidebook at the time wrote, quote, a more despicable, dangerous, and detestable character than the New York rough does not exist. He is an epitome of all the meanness and vices of humanity, end quote. Now, while Whitman clearly wanted to be seen as a fringe figure on the margins of society as demonstrated by this image, it's also important to understand that he wanted to be regarded as a representative American poet, perhaps the representative American poet. In fact, in one anonymous self-review, he identified the author of Leaves of Grass as, quote, an American bard. Now, the figure of an outsider who was also the everyman should sound familiar to you. We've seen it before in the figure of Andrew Jackson and the Republican hero. The preface to the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass is equal part manifesto, poetic theory, and long-winded diatribe. I've had you read just a little of this preface because I want you to get a sense of Whitman as self-consciously calling forth a new kind of poet and poetry. After 1855, Whitman will remove the preface and he takes some of its best parts to use in some of his later poems. But the preface does have a series of provocative statements that can help us better understand how to read and appreciate what Whitman is trying to do with his poetry. The first, that the United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. As you read the selections of Song of Myself, consider how Whitman attempts to capture the geographic and demographic diversity of America in his poetry. We've seen in the Hudson Valley River painters, this idea of the kind of grandeur of the American landscape. Whitman is going to replicate this in his poem, kind of down to the almost molecular level. Our next passage says, the present poem projects himself centuries ahead and judges performer or performance after the changes of time. This sentiment might sound a bit familiar to you. Remember how Emerson also wrote about the American scholar and the need for that person to look to the future rather than to the past. Now, we're going to see Whitman echoing or fulfilling many of Emerson's calls to action in his poem, and this is one of them. Finally, he says in this preface, there will soon be no more priests. A superior breed shall take their place. The gangs of cosmos and prophets en masse shall take their places. As you read through Song of Myself, consider how Whitman understands the relationship between poetry and religion. What is the role of God for Whitman, or faith, of religion in general in Whitman's work? You should be able to see some connections to the transcendentalist focus on experiential discovery and emotion and the attention of God in the universe in all of Whitman's work. Before we dive into the particulars of Song of Myself, I want to pause and show you a poem by famed British poet William Blake. In case you're unfamiliar, his poems are kind of seen as the epitome of 18th and 19th century British poetry and Romanticism. So his poem here, London, provides a really good example of a more traditional neoclassical style that was made famous by the British Romantics. Notice the way his poetry uses a clearly formal and British diction. The lines here have a clear and consistent rhyme scheme, and the meter is regular throughout. This feels like a very kind of old-fashioned traditional poem. When you compare this bit of Blake's poem to anything that Whitman writes, you should see an immediate difference, even if you know absolutely nothing at all about poetry. Whitman invents free verse. He does not care about the regularity of end rhymes. He is unconcerned about meter. He writes in a common American diction. And much of Song of Myself reads as long lists cataloging aspects of American life instead of the lofty ideals that we would find in neoclassical poetry. As you turn to your reading of the poem, keep this difference in mind. Now, it's normal for us to think of poetry as being very kind of loosey-goosey, right? Like anything can be a poem. With spoken word and hip-hop verses, we're used to free-flowing language of contemporary poetry. But when Whitman is first writing Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself, this doesn't exist. His verses are something completely new and radical, and it's because of him that we have what comes later. So let's dig into Song of Myself and talk about some of the themes and the formal features that you'll want to pay attention to as you complete the assigned readings. First, I want to recognize that Song of Myself can feel like a very difficult poem, even if its language seems almost modern and a lot simpler than Blake's. The poem moves in a lot of different directions and covers quite a bit of territory, both geographically and thematically. But one of the things that we can do to kind of anchor our understanding of the poem is to pay attention to the speaker. Now, in poetry, the speaker is the equivalent of the narrator that we have in fiction. It is a formal element of poetry, and the speaker here is a formal element of the poem. As you read through Whitman's verses, consider who is speaking. What do you know about this person? How would you describe them? What details do they give you to clue you in about their identity? In a lot of the lyrical poems that are coming out of the Romantic or Neoclassic poets, the speaker tends to be a persona of the poet himself, a version of the writer. In earlier poems, in classical poems, the speaker will often wax on rhapsodically about some matter of great personal importance. Think about the speakers of Phyllis Wheatley's poems or Philip Freneau's poems. We looked at those early in the semester because I wanted you to have a clear comparison between the kind of before and the after that we get with Whitman. Both of those earlier poets are very, very formal. Their speakers feel very formal, and they hold themselves at a distance to their readers. In Song of Myself, however, Whitman does not imagine that his listeners are overhearing him. Instead, he addresses us directly with a bold declaration that, quote, "What I assume, you shall assume." He speaks right to us. Now, start your reading by asking yourself whether this statement comes across as a command from Whitman that we must think as he does, that our assumptions must be his assumptions. Or is it better to read the statement of shared sympathies based on the idea that Whitman wants to assume what we assume, that he wants us to all share a common set of experiences? Our interpretation of these first two lines depends in many ways on our interpretation of the third line. For every atom belongs to me as good belongs to you. What does it mean to say that we all share the same atoms, that at some fundamental atomic level, we are all one united organism? Again, this idea should sound familiar to you. Emerson also talked about humanity, nature, and the universe being connected. If you remember the excerpts that we talked about in an earlier lecture from Nature, Emerson brought up the idea of the microcosm, this notion that all of the universe could be seen as we examine one single leaf. Well, Whitman takes this idea and runs with it. The title of the book, Leaves of Grass, indicates that he's very much doing what Whitman has urged us to do. In sitting and studying single leaves of grass, the various episodes in the poem are articulating the idea that all of humanity, indeed all of creation, is a single entity. Throughout the litany of parts and stanzas, Whitman's poetry attempts to recapture this sense of creation as a unified organism by breaking down barriers between people, places, and things. The stanza that immediately follows this philosophical meditation on the unity of experience is the almost more mundane declaration that the poet's just kind of hanging out. I loaf and looking at the grass on a summer day. Here, Whitman is saying that in order to apprehend the oneness of creation, we need to slow down and look at the world with fresh eyes. This feels almost like a very contemporary notion. If you think about contemporary ideas of mindfulness, of being present in the present moment, this is exactly what Whitman is telling us about. As you read, think about how the rest of the poem functions as a casual observation of the world around us. Now, one of the things that first-time readers of Whitman's poetry tend to complain about is the seemingly disjointed nature of the very episodes. Sometimes it feels like he's just bouncing from one idea to the next, but it can help to think of these episodes as a series of casual observations made by someone trying to slow the world down to be wholly and completely present. As the passages from the previous slide indicate, one of the keys to understanding Song of Myself is to read the poem as a collection of incidents that collectively illustrate the principle that creation is a unified whole, and the boundaries that we put between people, men and women, blacks and whites, places, north and south, urban and rural, and things, high art and low art, refinement and poverty. These are all artificial constructs that limit our vision. His goal in the poem is to bring them all together as one. So as we go through, you want to kind of take a look and pay attention to the way that he is unifying creation. Another thing that we'll want to pay attention to is how he's unifying the physical and the spiritual world, the body with the soul. Sometimes this comes off as even romantic or sexual. So the passages quoted on this slide illustrate another key to the poem, the unity of the physical and spiritual world, particularly with respect to the body and the soul. It's really, really important for Whitman. Whitman did not believe in the centuries-old notion that the body is a coarse and imperfect host for a pure and perfect soul. Instead, he believed that the physical experience of the body and the spiritual experience of the soul were of equal importance. He says, I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul. I believe in you, my soul. The other I must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. Loaf with me on the grass. Loose the stop from your throat. Not words, not music or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your valved voice. Song of Myself is a particularly good example of Whitman's desire to create this union between the body and the soul. And as you read section 5, notice the ways that the speaking voice is making an almost romantic invitation to the soul. Unloose the stop at your throat. Loosen up your shirt. Get comfortable. Loaf with me on the grass. What does Whitman achieve by imagining a romantic, even a sexual interlude between the body and the soul? Pay attention to his attempts to unify the body and the soul at this early moment in the poem, because it really helps to open up later sections where Whitman continues to bring together the spiritual and the physical. Also notice how he never elevates the soul over the body. Throughout the poem, they will always be truly equivalent. Sexuality and eroticism that happen in the poem aren't the lofty and poetic verses of the past. They're never spoken of in euphemisms. Sexuality and the erotic are situated in the body. Bodies that sweat, bodies that smell, bodies that we live in. When he says the aroma of his armpits is finer than the incense of the most religious church, he means it. He sees the body itself as holy, and he creates that divinity throughout the poem. So that brings us to one of our last big themes in this poem, which is divinity. In the preface to the 1855 edition, as we've seen, he declared that soon there will be no more priests. Whitman, throughout this poem, takes the idea that humanity and nature are already holy. Throughout the poem, he creates a new belief system that will take the place of organized religion as he seeks God in the face of all men and women and his own face. This ultimately is a highly humanist religious stance, and one that we see as linked to transcendentalism. So you might want to pause here so that you can look at some of these passages. You can see these are from sections 48 towards the end of the poem, and there's some of the more important passages in the poem. In all of these passages, we can start with the first one. We see Whitman clearly describing this new religious belief system that he imagines will take this place. Now, think about what that means to see the face of God in other men and women, or even in one's own face. Remember that Whitman is living at a time when we have the rhetoric of equality through the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. But in practice, that is not the case. Women are not full citizens. They don't have the right to vote at Whitman's time. And when Whitman is alive, he lives through the Civil War. For the first part, when he is writing this poem, there are millions of people within the country that are enslaved. So by calling the reader to see unity throughout humanity, he's critiquing a status quo of his time. He's critiquing the kind of conformity of that culture. Now, whether or not you're inclined to share Whitman's vision of a humanist religion that replaces God with other people, this idea of seeing the divine in the everyday can help you better understand the entire poem of Song of Myself. As you read the various sections, note the tone of the poem. So section 15 is a really great example of this. It's a very, very long list. Section 15 kind of goes on and on with this list of people and professions, and it almost seems tedious at first. But if you think of Whitman as really trying to witness even the most mundane scenes of human life as holy, it can adjust our thinking of section 15. The length of the list should make more sense once you realize that he's really trying to see the face of God in the face of a machinist, a carpenter, a spinning girl, or any of the other people he mentions in that exhaustive catalog of American types. So, I've tried to select some of the better known sections of Song of Myself for you to read, especially some of the stanzas that contain the most famous lines in American literature. As you read, I want you to notice two different levels of the poem, the formal level and the thematic. Formally, Whitman revolutionized not only poetry, but poetry in general. I really cannot overstate how important he is globally to just the very idea of what a poem is. He disrupted notions of what counted as poetry by rejecting the regular meter and rhyme that was popular during his time and before. And by pioneering free verse, he changed the way American poets and poets throughout the world would approach poetry. Whitman wrote in a truly American style and idiom. He relied on regular American diction rather than some sort of lofty, formalized way of speaking. And we're going to see these formal elements come up again and again, especially in later poets. When we get to the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, he's going to reference Whitman specifically, but his kind of style of poetry is unable to have been in existence without Whitman. Thematically, Whitman is a direct line from the Transcendentalists. His poetry seems to almost answer Emerson's call for the new American poet, and we can see the same values that Emerson promoted, the emphasis of the unity of all things, the microcosm of life, and the divinity of humanity in the world. Now, as you read Whitman, try to enjoy how personable the poet is. I know sometimes it feels very disjointed and the lists can feel like a bit much, but he's also kind of a pleasure to read if you stop worrying about what you're supposed to get from it. He's not holding fancy rhymes or vocabulary over your head. Instead, he is inviting you, the reader, in, inviting you to loaf and enjoy the world as it is. So I hope you enjoy some of his lines. Look for some of these formal and thematic elements as you read. I'll put up another short video that hits some of the sections more specifically, just so that you know kind of what to look for. But I hope you enjoy your reading of the sections of Song of Myself and of Whitman. If you have any questions, as always, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to go over anything or to talk in more detail with you.